Up next, we are going to welcome JD Christopher. Jason is Principal Cyber Risk Advisor at the industrial cybersecurity company DRAGOS, where he blends innovative approaches for risk management with state-of-the-art technology and services across the company's product catalog. With over 15 years experience in cybersecurity and industrial control systems, Jason offers critical infrastructure expertise and successful cyber risk strategies. So JD, did I cover the highlights without too much? Because you're about to share with us some of the lessons from the trenches when it comes to regulation. And as one who myself works in the policy arena, I know regulation sometimes right, frequently either lagging behind or scratching your head going, ooh, should have called in the experts.
Yeah, for sure. No, you hit it on the head. And some of the things that I'll talk about will really be what we've seen so far, things that we've seen from NUANCED in particular, right? So that's the number one sector people think about when they think of ICS security and regulation. We do have regulation in cybersecurity in other sectors, but not so much as the in-depth things that we see in ICS on SIP. So that's what I'll be going through. And I'll blend that from my perspective as a former regulator. So there's a lot to unpack here.
No, absolutely. And if time permits, please drop questions in both the questions as well as the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And in any event, take it away from here.
Okay, cool. I will kill my video for the moment just to sort of save on bandwidth. But as we go through this, again, if there are any questions, love to be able to answer those towards the end here. So with regards to myself, that was an awesome intro, and I don't want to sort of belabor on any of those points and get into more about myself. I always love it when I have somebody else to introduce me because I always get embarrassed talking through what I do. But I've had a very lucky career. So I've also not only worked on things like NERC-CIP, but also worked on maturity models that sort of analyze what we're doing from security perspectives across the landscape here for industrial control systems. And I used to be an engineer myself. So I actually have been a practitioner installing and maintaining industrial control systems and have used that across my career pretty luckily. For those of you who are not familiar with DRAGOS, we actually have quite a bit of employees that were former practitioners such as myself. I think actually even this number is wrong. I think we're like at 200 people now, which is pretty crazy. We service primarily industrial firms. So you can see here, this is sort of a sampling of the different things that we examine. And what I want folks to think through as we talk about sort of what are the elements of industrial technologies, we're not talking about traditional IT. We're focused on the processes that will impact sort of the physical world, right? Things that are going to move a conveyor belt, move electricity in the purposes of the conversation today, or sort of things that would be fluids or things that we're physically doing in the real world. And these systems are complicated. Unlike your iPhone or laptop, we're talking about things that are measured on a life cycle of decades, not years. And the operations have to be on 24/7, right? When you turn on your light switch, you expect the light to turn on. And so parsing this out, and there's already been some really great conversations sort of previously on track one, talking through the critical infrastructure sectors. There's a lot that we want to be able to have a conversation around when we think through these real-world devices. And when I talk about industrial control systems, I want everyone not to think about data breaches, right? I'm not talking about credit card records. I'm not talking about sort of leaking of information. We're talking about something where a 0 or a 1, a piece of data actually controls something in the real world. So a couple of examples here. We have motors, we have generators, safety systems, input and output devices, anything that, again, will have a flow attached to it or some sort of measurement that is seen in the real world, in the physical world. For what we do on the electric sector side, so this is going to be your only real couple of slides talking about the electric sector. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I always want to be able to bring people into what it is that we mean when we talk about the sector as a whole. We always sort of start off with generating power. And then from that generating power, we want to have an economies of scale where these big transmission lines will transport that energy someplace else, where it'll go through a step down transformer to get us into safer voltages, similar to what you see in your home, right? 120 volt to 240 volt, much different than 138 kilovolts or 500 kilovolts. And when we think about it from a regulatory standpoint, when people talk about cybersecurity regulations or reliability regulations in the electric sector, they're really thinking about generation and transmission. Distribution is managed at the state level. So the federal things I'm going to talk about, the federal standards that we're going to walk through, won't apply to those distribution systems. And by the numbers, when we think through generation and transmission, again, this is not only helpful, this is information from DOE in terms of how many plants or the miles of lines we're talking about, but also what your monthly bill breakdown is. How many employees nationwide are employed in each of those pieces. And you can see here, distribution still has quite a bit. I mean, it's 1 million miles of line, 400,000 people nationwide. But when we think about the federal side and what is going on with the regulation, the generation and transmission is where the big impacts could occur, right? If we don't have the generating energy, it doesn't matter really the things that are happening on distribution. While distribution is very important for our day-to-day, we need to focus on the bigger impacts. And that's sort of what the federal regulation looked at from that cybersecurity perspective. And when we think about the sort of breakdown and the makeup of this thing, we are talking about the largest machine ever made. So the elements of a national power grid here, we can see that we're really not talking about quote unquote one grid. There are multiple grids. I know this is very complicated. This is actually public information on DOE's website, where you can sort of see all these different types of utilities called balancing authorities are balancing that generation and that load, that distribution at any given second, to make sure that there's enough generation to service people turning on all their air conditioners, or people responding to coming back home from the end of the day and turning on the TV. All these people are doing this sort of simultaneously. These utilities are managing this on a real-time basis, 24/7 by forever. So it's a really complicated sort of machine that we have here. Each grid will operate that balancing of load. Because again, if we have too much load, we could have a blackout, too much generation, you could have some really bad physics problems. And we're doing this all with only 5% losses. So when we think about sort of the economics of the machine, the optimization of the machine, it's really impressive. Just the fact that some of this technology is, yes, of course, dated, but we're doing sort of a lot in a sort of real-time basis on a day-to-day continuation. So how did we get here? This conversation about reliability and cybersecurity standards. Well, this started off actually with the 1965 New York City blackout. That was one of the very first sort of blackouts that impacted the nation on an economic level, on a sort of historical and cultural level even. And when we talk through this, what happened was these grid components, these utility components, for the first time started being interconnected. And the first major blackout in 1965 had utilities respond with creating the National Electric Reliability Council. This council was a voluntary body that would go through and do readiness evaluations based off standards to help best practices sort of come about within industry. And for many decades, that worked, right? These readiness evaluations where utilities would go in and sort of talk to other utilities, look at their practices and help them mature, until we had another blackout. And so in the Northeast blackout of 2003, this is when NERC, which is the voluntary body, became a mandatory body shortly afterwards. Changed their name to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is a non-for-profit organization that performs regulatory tasks on behalf of the federal government. That will include things like developing reliability standards, auditing these reliability standards. And now there are penalties associated with them, right? So these things that would have been voluntary to begin with now have penalties and a penalty structure that could go as high as $1 million per day per violation. And there are a lot of standards. When people talk about sort of the SIP standards or the cybersecurity standards that I'll introduce in a moment, one of the things that should also be in context is that they are just dozens of standards in the face of hundreds of standards that utilities need to worry about for reliable operation. Everything from what we do for that balancing of load and generation to how we communicate during events, or how we maintain voltage for those high transmission lines going into the distribution field. And it just keeps continuing, right? Things that we have to do for emergency operations, what we have to do for facility design, connections, and maintenance. All of these pieces built into what we call the NERC reliability standards. And then we have our cybersecurity considerations. I don't expect everybody to remember these things. There's not going to be a quiz at the end. Really, what I'm trying to highlight here is that there are a lot of requirements across the entire reliability space before we even get into talking about 33 requirements here in the current version of SIP version 6. We've had a lot of iterations in SIP. Actually, the most iterations across the reliability standards have happened in the cybersecurity space. We are on, in some cases, version 8 of certain SIP standards. Whereas if you look at things that are in the reliability context, they're still on version 0. And the reason for that is because the physics hasn't changed, right? The physics of the grid does not change rapidly. And so we can still have the equations that sort of guide us in that physics conversation all the way from the 1960s onward, whereas the cybersecurity context continually changes, not from necessarily a perspective of these requirements aren't helping us with the threats, but that we're still on a learning curve with cybersecurity, especially in industrial control systems. Well, the learning curve itself, the reason for that is it's a relatively new field for everybody, right? We've got over 100 years of context and information and data on how to reliably run a utility. We don't have as much sort of information and experience with that cybersecurity piece. And so this is a learning curve for everyone utilities involved. And SIP itself actually had a really interesting evolution. So it actually started as a voluntary standard, as what we call the urgent action standards. In this case, the first one, Urgent Action 1200, was actually approved by industry the day before the Northeast blackout, right? So August 14th, 2003 was the Northeast blackout. Industry voluntarily had a standard approved for cybersecurity on August 13th. The drafting team spent about 4 months on this first version, and it was only focused originally on control centers. And the reason for that is just sort of bring yourself back to the time period of the early 2000s. What were we worried about in cybersecurity as a control center for utilities in the early 2000s? It's not quite the threats we're talking back today, right? I think that Mark Weatherford did a really good job of describing the fact that the threats we face today are things that were on like the peripheral, like, oh, that could be a thing one day, but that wasn't what we were dealing with in 2003. Instead, we were dealing with things like untargeted malware, right? Slammer, Co-Red, Blaster, all these untargeted malware pieces finding their way into the control center. And so this very first voluntary standard was enacted by industry on what it should look like to lock down our control center so that this untargeted malware just can't find its way into the door. Shortly after that, we sort of expanded that to what we called Urgent Action 1300, which expanded the scope, field assets. So now we're talking about things that are on our transmission facilities, our substations, going further and further out from the control center. And then when NERC became the mandatory body, we had SIP version 1. And that became this new format, ANSI accredited, sort of externally validated standard body to be able to say, these are the standards we're going to format through. And again, no quiz at the end, but you could sort of see here, there are a lot of standards that need to be applied at a utility. So here are roughly the 14 standards that if they're not already implemented by utilities, they are soon to be by like a couple of weeks. Things like SIP 13 that we're talking about for supply chain management are just coming down the pike. These are historical context of some old standards and some new standards, and you can sort of see the different versioning that we have across them, the different iterations that industry has gone through to improve these standards with time. And if you talk to a utility, there will be some unique perspectives about how they feel about NERC SIP. The first will be talking through what is a zero deficiency requirement and how painful these things can be to actually implement on these systems. When a utility talks about a zero deficiency requirement, what they mean is that just one miss could lead you to having a possible violation. One miss could lead you to having a dollar penalty associated with it, even if it could be administrative in nature. And so these zero deficiency requirements are unyielding in the eyes of utilities. And there are regional differences in the audits and the techniques. So depending on your utility size, they may have to talk to multiple different auditors about their perspective on enforcing these standards, which could lead to a lot of inconsistencies across their geographic footprint when they're working through this. Now, this problem has improved, same thing with zero deficiencies, but it's still sort of at the forefront of all of our knowledge on cybersecurity when it comes to utility management. There's also lack of clarity on quote unquote how to comply. Some utilities absolutely want to hear more about how they can comply with the requirements. Other utilities, though, don't. They want the flexibility and the freedom. So that's why I call this the double-edged sword conundrum, where some utilities want the freedom and the flexibility as long as they are meeting what they should achieve in the SIP standards. They don't want somebody to tell them how to achieve it. With as many utilities as we have across the United States, there are over 3,000. 1,800, 2,000 or so need to actually comply with NERC SIP, which means there are going to be a lot of different approaches here. And so that flexibility may be really important to some utilities, whereas other utilities who are more maturing into this really want somebody to tell them how this should be enacted. And you'll also hear from utilities that evidence collection is a burden. It's evidence collection, no matter what, for audits is always going to be burdensome, right? That's going to be true for any field. That's true for the legal field, for safety, for finance. Having audit trails by themselves is going to be its own discipline. Now, when we talk about it for industrial control systems, because these systems don't act and feel and look like a computer normally does, that data collection could be even more difficult. It could be relying on manual processes, on engineers sort of filling out more documentation or vendor documentation even. So documentation outside the utility, adding towards this complexity and to this problem. And you'll also hear from utilities sort of this people process technology limitations. We often talk about within ICS security, there are hundreds of us, there are thousands of us maybe at this point. We're doing really well at educating and growing the ICS security field with better practitioners that understand more and can get certified now and have additional conversations, but it's still going to be a limiting factor. Same thing with what you can do on the technology side for industrial control systems. And lastly, probably what I'll do my best job debunking over the next few slides is this conversation that compliance does not equal security. That there is some sort of two-brain scenario of what I have to do to be secure versus what I have to do to be compliant. And I'll address that a little bit later. You then need to compare these perspectives from the utility to the regulatory perspectives. What are the auditors and the regulators thinking? Their challenges that they have in enforcing the SIP standards. The number one question, and this has actually been asked by the regulators, is enough covered? Are enough devices that are running the grid covered by these standards? And is that coverage the right set of requirements? This is because this evolution is happening where we're first drilling towards cybersecurity. Regulators are openly asking questions about this. As a matter of fact, there are 2 dockets that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had open in August, trying to ask this question of industry, saying, well, are we doing enough here? And from a regulator's perspective, from an auditor's perspective, the lack of evidence could mean a lack of security. So of course, they're going to focus on that evidential techniques, on the compliance techniques, maybe more so than some of the other security conversations that would take place in industry. And you'll see this too, and I'll sort of actually highlight this in some regulatory rules, that compliance needs to be baked into security, that it should not be this adversarial relationship. Oh, we do something different over here because it's SIP. No, it needs to be something that is ingrained in sort of the DNA of the utility. And regulators also talk about their own process, people, and technology limitations, not just from the how can they talk to utilities about this, but can a state regulator, as an example on distribution, hire the right people to review filings from a utility? And how do they sort of compete with that? If you're working in the state government, you'll know that the salaries do not match what's in the private sector. And so how do they get sort of the best in class, or at least a conversation going with a utility when they may not have the right people to be able to answer the filings themselves? But here is the nuanced truth. We have seen violations increasing, particularly in SIP version 5. So we had a good historical context for the pre-SIP version 5. Version 5 had this brand new way of thinking about how to categorize and classify our assets and our systems. And violations were actually decreasing under sort of the old regime because utilities were learning, they were doing better. But version 5 had its own learning curve. And so now we've seen an uptick all of a sudden in those violations. Again, not necessarily being security related, they could be administrative in nature, or there could be this human aspect that I'll explore momentarily. Industry is improving, so we are getting lessons learned. They are being applied. There are now industry exercises, and we now have a national level event, GridX, which is the largest national level exercise in the country that utilities participate in on a every 2-year basis. But there's also going to be these mixed cultural impacts. You have over 2,000 utilities trying to apply the same requirements, but looking at it from a different lens perhaps, or having different interpretations. Some people will get it, others will not, and that learning curve and those lessons learned need to be sort of shared more broadly for people to be able to adapt them to their systems. Okay, so with that, I'd like to spend the last sort of part of this discussion on what has actually happened as a result of all this. So now you've got some historical context behind the standards. You have additional context behind why we're doing what we do as an industry. And I actually went through and looked at some FERC filings. So FERC filings themselves, when a regulator or an auditor finds something, if it leads itself to being a violation, there are ways that they get filed to FERC, and I'm actually going to explore some of those. The ones I'm looking at are called Find, Fix, Track. So hence the clever title, the dad joke here, what the FFT. The FFTs are a good way if you're a utility to find out what other utilities have had to do in terms of something went wrong and they had to go to the auditor or self-report and talk about it. They are all unidentified registered entities, what we call UREs. So we won't have utility names called out, and that's on purpose. If you think about that from a security perspective, you don't want a utility to get targeted by an adversary because they filed something as part of an audit. And so really making sure that there is this separation of what went wrong, provide that lesson learned for industry so that people can adapt and change their program as relevant, but also not necessarily having attackers focus on an individual utility because they know that this incident could have occurred in a different way other than a self-report or an audit like I'm about to show you. You'll also see in these filings from FERC sort of insights from the regulators. They will be very open and clear about what it is that they are looking at and how they're exploring things. So there's a lot of good conversation there about what is your auditor thinking. They are very open about it. And also areas of non-compliance. So I'll show you some instances where the compliance control failed, and I'll also show you some really, really weird moments. As a matter of fact, why don't we start off with some really weird moments? So the "but my boss said so" conversation. So I've actually got a FERC filing number here. So if you want to, you could read the full FERC filing. The description of what happened here is a supervisor, under the direction of his manager, reported to a critical substation to distribute quarterly awareness material. This awareness material is actually required in the SIP standards. So they're out there doing their SIP job. The supervisor badged into the substation perimeter, but his badge did not work. So he used a physical key reserved for card key reader failures. Their boss told him to go out to the substation. So if it didn't work, they're just gonna use the key that they have for any badge read error. Upon using that key to enter the physical site, however, they entered an area they did not have access to. It was not a badge read error. And it turns out that the supervisor sent somebody out to go put up quarterly awareness who did not actually have access to that site, which is a lot of other requirements that we have in NERC SIP. So performing the compliance task itself led to a violation, right? So when we think about what these violations look like, they're not all doom and gloom. This is something that absolutely somebody violated an access control policy, but somewhere else this check and balance of what it is that we had to do to post this awareness material into a substation needed to be considered. So whenever a procedure could happen, just even any compliance activity, it could lead to another possible violation. Really weird moment, but one that I like to be able to share when people talk about the violations of what compliance could do. Who watches the Watchmen? This is another event. This one was from 2013. There were self-reports. So utilities, instead of just having to worry about an event or an audit, if they have robust compliance controls, they will self-report. They will voluntarily report when something happens to the organization and say, hey, this is what took place. So 2 separate self-reports where previously unidentified devices were connected to an industrial network. In both cases, the utility found the devices during an annual physical walkdown of the generation facilities. What's interesting here is that they caught an area of non-compliance by following a more robust control, doing these walkdowns, right? So it allows there to be this give and take of where it is that we are checking ourselves. And that's what a good compliance program should do, right? In security standards, we're doing something for a reason, and these compliance controls are allowing us to have that additional conversation around that. Poorly scripted. This is an event from a few years back as well, where a utility identified the lack of alerting on multiple devices. When they examined it, it turned out that yes, they did follow the compliance checklist for having that device enabled. However, there was a typo in one of the scripts that they were running, one of the automated scripts that they had, where automation is absolutely our friend when it works. You can't go to an auditor and say, oh, I was not compliant because of a typo. I mean, you can, but it's still up to you to verify and check these things. So while that would be a technical control that would have been missed, there's still sort of this administrative nature at the end of the day that led to that lack of compliance. So I think a lot of people would have wanted to hear me talk about the typical things we do with ICS security, right? We can't do antivirus or we can't do access controls on those things. But that's not what any of these events had in common. When I think through the events that we just talked about, these events have human factors as the leading cause of what happened, of why these things failed. And finally, the last event that I want us to talk through is the big one. You're a tough one. So this was another unidentified entity, the largest penalty to date. If you go through and sort of read the filing from FERC, it's huge. It's a 250-page redacted notice of penalty that had details of 127 identified violations. 13 of those are serious, 62 were moderate, 52 were minimal, over a 4-year period that led to a $10 million penalty. This is a huge one. There's been a lot of press on this, so I won't belabor the point too much. But I do want folks, if they start reading through that, when you think through those penalties and as you start reading through it, you'll hear it loud and clear from the regulator. The largest problem, the key takeaway from that, was a culture issue. One of the key quotes that came from the auditor: organizational silos in the form of a lack of communication between management levels within the compliance, which contributed to a lack of awareness of the security and compliance of that utility. Another interesting one: the root causes of these violations were cultural issues that resulted in URE management's lack of awareness, engagement, and accountability for SIP compliance. Now, you may say, that's a really interesting quote, and it is. The thing about this quote is it was not just in this one filing. If you go through and read sort of these notice of penalties at the regulator level, you'll see that this is a common quote. This routinely comes up as sort of the root cause of the violation being a cultural issue, a management issue, and not as much as a technology issue that we typically talk about. To wrap up, one of the things that we'll hear about when you talk to a regulator is what they expect to see in a culture of compliance. So you'd expect to see sort of a management level in that. What does the leadership do for that? This is actually from a FERC filing. This was a policy document that came out in 2008 where FERC actually said, this is what I want to see out of utilities with a good culture of compliance. So having a management structure that encourages compliance, a chain of command where you have access to the CEO or board, maybe even a compliance committee as part of that, and establishing a program around that, a formal program with resources. And as part of that resources, you have the people, funding, and the tools to do your job in compliance, and the enablement for employees to get training, the tools, the resources they need to ensure compliance is their battle to fight as well as internal controls, not being fearful of the auditor more so than you're fearful of an attack, right? Being able to bake this into one thing. So the actual lessons learned that people should have going into this compliance conversation is having a healthy culture, making sure that CISOs and executives embrace both security and compliance as part of that, and assessing your maturity, because this is going to be a continual lesson learned that we have. There will be new versions of the SIP standards. There'll be more violations, and we do need to understand that from a cultural perspective. And also understanding that compliance needs to be part of our DNA as utilities, as organizations in the industrial side. We say that we want to be at the big boys table, and in order to do that, we should also embrace that the big boys tables has audits, right? You have audits in finance, you have audits in safety, we're going to have audits in security, and it double checks that we're supposed to do what we say that we're going to do. If you want to learn more, there are a lot of resources out there for compliance. I'm actually in the middle of a 5-day course right now that I teach for SANS on the essentials for NERC SIP critical protections. going through the compliance perspective as well as the technology perspective. But you can also read those FERC filings I talked about, as well as go to industry workshops, other training opportunities, or even just looking at regional newsletters. And I thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and a great perspective for everyone tuning in today, and a reminder that all of the talks are being recorded, and you'll be able to go back and check out some of these other resources, as well as listen to the talk presentation again via ICS Village website and YouTube channel. And anyway, thank you again, JD, for your time and insights.
Appreciate it.
As